The last time I had the pleasure of addressing this group, I was talking about SIFTA, which is the OAS's gun control and gun trafficking treaty. I, with my colleague Steve Groves, also at the Heritage Foundation, have moved on now to concern about U.S. landmine policy. And as Ben said, I'd like to update you briefly on the course of U.S. policy and some of the dangers we see looming ahead on this. What I'm talking about today is formally known as the, quote, Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their Destruction. This is fortunately and commonly known as the Ottawa Convention. If any of you are familiar with the campaign, maybe I should call it the crusade, waged by Princess Di, you'll have some idea of what we're talking about here. This convention concerns anti-personnel landmines, not anti-vehicle landmines. But for the purposes of convenience, I'll simply call it the Ottawa Convention. Now, in November 2009, the Obama administration announced that it had already conducted a review of U.S. landmine policy. The result of this review, essentially, was that the Bush administration's policy was upheld. And the Bush policy and the initial Obama policy was to strike a balance between military concerns and humanitarian concerns. The gist of the policy was that the U.S. should phase out what are known as persistent landmines. Persistent landmines are landmines that don't have a timer inside, a timer that forces them to self-destruct and or self-deactivate after a given user-settable amount of time. And this policy complies with Protocol 2 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which was ratified in 1999. And as I said, it seeks to strike a balance between the military utility of anti-personnel landmines and the humanitarian obligations that the United States and a number of other nations have accepted through Protocol number 2. Unfortunately, U.S. policy and its adherence to Protocol 2 wasn't good enough for an NGO coalition known as the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. The ICBL wants exactly what its name suggests. It wants a complete ban on all landmines, persistent or not. It doesn't matter if they turn off, self-deactivate, self-destruct. It is simply opposed to landmines per se. The ICBL's argument is that landmines are inherently indiscriminate, inherently dangerous to non-combatants, and therefore have to be universally banned because of this humanitarian danger. Now, after the Obama administration in November 2009 made its announcement that it was essentially continuing Bush's policy, it came under a lot of pressure from the ICBL and from a very large number of senators, 68 in fact, to reverse its decision and to seek to ratify the Ottawa Convention. Now, some of those 68 senators, 11 to be exact, are no longer senators. But still, 57 senators is a substantial number of U.S. senators. And it suggests that there is still considerable momentum, even in this new Congress, behind urging the United States to move towards joining the Ottawa Convention. As a result of the senatorial pressure, the administration is now conducting a second review of U.S. landmine policy. My view, and the view of my colleague Steve Groves, is that the U.S. shouldn't ratify the Ottawa Convention for three basic reasons. The first reason is military. The U.S. used landmines in the First Persian Gulf War and in Operation Enduring Freedom. Studies by the National Research Council and by NATO have confirmed that landmines continue to provide important capabilities that can't be provided in any other way. The Ottawa Convention would not allow the U.S. to keep remotely delivered anti-personnel mines, that is, anti-personnel mines that are fired from artillery or dropped by planes. It would also not allow the U.S. to continue to use pursuit deterrent munitions, which are small landmines placed by U.S. Special Forces to discourage enemy forces from pursuing them when they wish to break contact. Even the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a major proponent of the Ottawa Convention, concedes that no readily available technology delivers the military capabilities of landmines. Its list of suggestive alternatives, which include things like military slip and slides, does make really fantastic reading, however. In short, the Ottawa Convention is militarily flawed. Second, the Ottawa Convention is a result of a flawed process. It was created by a short, sharp crusade led by a small number of states and a large number of NGOs Few, if any, of these states were major security players. They broke away from the CCW process in Geneva because they wanted a rapid all-or-nothing solution to the problem of landmines, an all-or-nothing approach that's been rejected by the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration. This kind of NGO-led process is inherently objectionable to believers in effective and serious arms control, as well as supporters and defenders of American sovereignty alike. It substitutes moral fervor for careful diplomacy. It gives bad actors an institution they can hide behind, and it creates the illusion, and only the illusion, of effective arms control. It is also anti-sovereignty, in that it accords equal status to activists and unelected NGOs that it does to traditional nation states. Finally, the third reason why we regard the convention as unacceptable. It itself is flawed and, we believe, dangerous. It doesn't allow the Senate to attach reservations, which is a basic part of the Senate's constitutional duty. It is literally an all-or-nothing document. It relies on the UN and fundamentally on trust to verify compliance. It will lead activists to go on to attack other targets, such as cluster munitions, which in fact they have already succeeded in drafting a convention on, and drones. And if you read the legal literature now, you will see that it is overflowing with legal criticisms of the U.S. reliance on drones. That, after cluster munitions, will be the next target, with all due respect to space, that this activist community is likely to go after. Finally, the Ottawa Convention has not worked in practice. China and Russia, among other states, have not signed it, and even the activists conclude that at least 6 charter signatories of the Ottawa Convention used anti-personnel landmines after they signed the convention, and those are only the 6 that we know about. Far from the convention leading to the dawn of an anti-APL-free era, the adoption of the convention in 1999 marked the rise of the IED. Now, not all IEDs are landmines. Some of them would be classified as booby traps. But it is absolutely not true to say that Ottawa has led to a worldwide moral and humanitarian consensus against the use of IED-type devices. In fact, rather the reverse has happened. The problem with anti-personnel landmines, in short, isn't anti-personnel landmines. It is the irresponsible users of a weapon that can and should be used responsibly, as the U.S. is doing. Similarly, the problem with the Ottawa Convention is that it is irresponsible. It creates perverse incentives, it's unenforceable, and it's the result of a process that openly elevated unelected transnational NGOs at the expense of sovereign, democratically elected nation states. We therefore conclude that the Ottawa process is not something the United States should support, and that it should retain the ability to use anti-personnel landmines as long as they are militarily necessary. Now, what are the odds that the Obama administration, in this review of landmine policy, is going to recommend ratification of the Ottawa Convention? I think the odds that they will do that are fairly low. What they are much more likely to do is to say that the U.S. should seek to move towards ratification of the Ottawa Convention and to be in a position to achieve ratification, to pick a random date by, let's say, 2017. This is the kind of tactic that President Clinton pioneered. It's a tactic designed to win applause from the activist community and to toss a hand grenade into the next administration. And I think it's what the Obama administration is likely to do in this sort of case. Indeed, kick the ball into the next administration. In short, I think the Ottawa Convention looks likely to become another ABM treaty or another international criminal court. A commitment made by a previous administration that poses dangers to our security and our sovereignty that a more sensible future administration is going to have to spend a good deal of time, energy, and political capital trying to set right, and a commitment from which future administrations will probably ultimately find it very difficult to escape. Thanks. Be happy to take some questions.
Questions for Ted. Ted, let me start with my own question while others gather their thoughts. You mentioned this letter from 68 senators from last year, I believe. My recollection, correct me if I'm wrong, was that the lead senator on that was Senator Leahy.
That's correct.
And he, of course, is still here. I'm wondering can you expand a little bit on your sense of where he may be on this issue, if this is a priority you think he will try to take up again?
I think it's quite likely that Senator Leahy and several other senators will continue to pursue this. With what success, I don't know. When you take a look at the signatories of the letter, some of them are what I would tend to classify as the usual suspects. Others were rather more surprising. You don't get 68 signatures on a letter from the United States Senate without having a reasonably wide cross-section of senatorial opinion. So one of Steve's and my reasons for writing this paper was simply because we think that a lot of people who are sincerely interested in promoting humanitarian concerns, and there are legitimate humanitarian concerns involved here, simply regarded anti-personnel landmines as something that Lady Di didn't like. And therefore, that is really enough information for them. That they didn't really read any of the conventions involved. They didn't take advice from the military experts. They didn't consider the unanimous opinion of NATO, the National Research Council. This was simply, I think in some cases, though certainly not at all, a vote based on emotion or a signature based on emotion and sentiment. Now, in the case of some other senators, I think there's a much deeper, I wouldn't perhaps say a much more well-informed commitment behind it, but a much more passionate, almost indeed, I would say a religious commitment that anti-personnel landmines and indeed landmines in general are fundamentally morally unacceptable and must be eliminated. How many of the senators fall into that category is difficult to say, but not enough of them to force the Senate to seriously consider this if the rest of them are peeled off.
Dan, if you could just wait for the mic for a second. Thanks.
Hi. Thanks. Has the Army been vociferous in making some of the points you have? The U.S. military being stepping up to its responsibility to let people know what their military capabilities, effectiveness,
the armed forces in this country do have an issue with doing things like that because they are controlled by the civilians. So it's not really their place, with all due respect to the armed forces, to go around and make lobbying statements that are not in accord with the administration position, no matter what one happens to think about that position. If you read the NATO report, if you read the NRC report, if you read statements that have been made by previous defense civilian officials, you are left in no doubt whatsoever that there continue to be situations, there are not many, but they are important, where landmines are important to the security of the United States and its allies. It is obvious that Korea is one of them. One barely even needs to mention this to make the point. If one says Korea to the anti-mine activists, their response is essentially a shrug. They don't care. If you mention the U.S. use of landmines in the first Gulf War or in Operation Enduring Freedom, again, I mean, these serious military concerns are irrelevant. What they will do, what they did, in fact, in the course of securing the Ottawa Convention and its signature and ratification by a large number of nations, was to parade victims of landmines in front of the delegates. Well, that's all very well and good. What the people who don't get paraded in front of delegates are members of the U.S. Special Forces who had their lives saved, or any citizen of the Republic of South Korea who live in peace and prosperity, thanks, among other things, to the U.S. use of landmines. There is a relentless focus on victims, and I certainly agree that the U.S. should do all it can, consonant with military utility and the traditional understanding of the laws of war, to reduce humanitarian concerns. But humanitarian concerns entirely trump any legitimate military consideration in the eyes of the activists. And this is an absolute rejection of the traditional laws of war, which are based on balancing humanitarian concerns and the legitimate use of military force.
I have what is the range of possibilities in terms of this coming up in the next year, I guess? Or
First, we have to have the review. Now, if the Obama administration were really smart and highly motivated, they would kick this into the grass and it would never emerge until maybe, I don't know, the last day of 2012 or something like that. My sense is that there is enough political pressure out there, deriving partly from the Senate and deriving partly from an extremely activist NGO community. You're talking about a coalition of over 1,000 NGOs Now, some of them are probably a man and his dog, so the numbers don't necessarily amount to quite as much as they say. Nonetheless, if you go online, you will find reams of pro-Ottawa, anti-landmine literature. In fact, we wrote this paper in large part because we could not find anywhere a single conservative statement by any think tank or any organization of a serious position on landmine policy. We're the only ones out there. Yeah, it is a complete vacuum. 99.99% of the advocacy on this subject is entirely one-sided and entirely pro-Ottawa without giving any serious concern to military utility or to the balancing that humanitarian law has traditionally engaged in.
Other questions for Ted? Yes, Jeff.
I take it from what you just said, there have been no serious hearings in the Congress about landmines, in the Senate, and is there a prospective role that the House could play in this now that it's in more responsible hands?
Until we get the Obama administration's review on this, and I am presuming that we will get the review at some point in 2011, it's very difficult to know what the roles of the Senate or the House will be. The Ottawa Convention is a treaty. If the administration, and I think this is unlikely, decides that they're going to seek ratification of it, the House has really no role in that process, aside from serving as a bully pulpit and a place where influential individuals can voice their concerns. If the administration decides that the U.S. will seek to move towards a position of being able to ratify the convention, which I regard as the more likely outcome, the House does have a role through its control of the purse strings, fundamentally, to try, given the Senate and the presidency, to keep U.S. spending policy on the correct track. But that's going to be difficult. The U.S. is not procuring many landmines anymore. It is still purchasing some, but we're not talking enormous amounts of money here. As a result, I think programs like this tend to be fairly vulnerable, even leaving aside the sort of political issues involved. And again, I revert to the number of Republican as well as Democratic senators who signed this letter. There is a substantial amount of, I think, ill-informed conservative opinion on this subject as well. Individuals who view it as basically a cost-free vote on humanitarianism that make me, until this process of education continues, somewhat skeptical that the House is going to be either able constitutionally or willing to really step up and play a major role.
From an information dissemination perspective, now that the paper's out there, is it at your website?
Yes, it is.
Okay. What can other groups do, or what are you doing to get it out there so that the debate can be engaged? Because the biggest problem, of course, is that everyone's assuming there is no debate.
Right. Our first step has been to try to go to the Hill and to meet with as many staff as we can from senators who we regard as perhaps having signed this out of an excess of humanitarian concern and perhaps an insufficiency of knowledge. And we think that's fundamentally the most important thing, because if senators, or at least their staffs, are well informed on this issue, we're reasonably confident that a lot of them will side with the U.S. Armed Forces and encourage the U.S. to continue its current policy, which is to use and develop responsible deactivating landmines. And that's a very reasonable thing to do. In the broader public concern, it is very difficult to come out with, and we are not pro-landmine. We are pro-balancing the necessary defense needs of the United States with necessary humanitarian concerns. But opponents will always caricature that as you are pro-landmine. And then one immediately gets, the gory pictures, the gruesome details. And this is a public relations strategy which, I'm sorry if this strikes people as too pessimistic, the other side has a fundamental and enduring advantage in, because our picture is of a peaceful and prosperous South Korea, and their picture is of a suffering individual. And I'm sorry to say that a peaceful and prosperous South Korea, or a living member of the U.S. Special Forces with all their limbs, doesn't beat someone who's had a leg blown off.
I might just also add that this strikes me as a wonderful issue to be taken up by the Congressional Sovereignty Caucus. currently chaired by Congressman Lamborn. It's an entity that I know Heritage and Center and Freedom Alliance have worked with closely in the past, and I think that that could be yet another vehicle to kind of start engaging this debate on the Capitol Hill level.
Indeed, and this is why in this piece we devoted so much emphasis to pointing out that the Ottawa Convention is unacceptable, not simply for military reasons, but also because it represents bad, transnational, NGO-driven, anti-state arms control that is ineffective militarily as well as dangerous politically.
Well, I think we're coming up close to the end of our time. Do we have any more questions for Ted on this issue? If not, Ted, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is terrific.
We did have one good of the order item.